Hello working group members, another slideshow on Avalanche instructor competencies and guidelines. This time we're talking about guidelines that would be appropriate for P2 instructors. So in this presentation I will review the specific item in our charter that applies to developing guidelines for P2 practice. I will review the layers of protection concept very briefly, and then I will develop some layers of protection appropriate for P2 instructor practice that focuses on how using familiar terrain can allow P2 instructors to engage in more varied types of instruction that take them beyond the rigid terrain restrictions of P1 practice. So from our existing work and from our charter, we already have some starting points. In particular, the P2 functions effectively under the following workplace conditions: moderately structured environment, an established or developing avalanche program, decision making is subject to established protocols, and general direction is provided. These P2 workplace conditions contrast with those of the P1 in that the somewhat more latitude is provided to the P2 so that the workplace environment can be moderately structured instead of fully structured, suggesting that the P2, the practice of the P2 is sufficiently developed that good practice can be maintained. The latitude of the P2 is also increased in terms of working with an established or developing avalanche program. On the supervision front, likewise, the P2 functions where a general direction is provided rather than ongoing and specific direction provided. Again, the P2 has more latitude to act independently. The working group terms of reference that are specific to this part of the project suggest that we should be working to find the attributes of the work setting, such as familiarity or availability of external resources that can be used as indicators or as assurances that risks are well handled. And so our orders from the board are to really look at guidelines for existing P2 practice that will fit into the competency profile as adopted last year. So another little bit of review is to recap where we came to in our last slideshow presentation about the layers of protection provided by workplace guidelines. So the classic use of reasons model is to describe the causes of accidents by thinking of the conceptual space between a hazard and the loss that it can cause as occupied by layers of security or defense, and each offer separate protection against the threats that arise. Each layer of defense has areas of vulnerability that are susceptible to the specific threats. The idea is that defenses between the hazard and the harm can be divided into categories that can be considered separately. These layers of protection can be designed in ways that dramatically affect barriers to practice. And so you can look at the many ways that the layers of protection can be constructed, but better solutions provide both protection to participants and opportunities for instructors to work. So next we want to recap the identified priorities and vulnerabilities at the P1 level from a lot of the background work we did for this project, and then so we can take it to the P2 level. So at the P1 level, we found that rules-based instruction at the introductory level is likely the most effective way to go about avalanche education. And we also found that mitigation and rescue were topics that were particularly effective at this level. So the other thing that we discovered was that instructor availability outside of core backcountry skiing settings is rather thin, but at the same time, in these same areas, the introductory avalanche education is a key part of the avalanche safety net. The other thing that we determined in our conversation that was really important for the work of this group is that there's a feeling that the high consequence environment of avalanches means that the risks inherent in avalanche education to both students and instructors aren't reflected in the statistical record up till now. And the working group was clear that the wisdom of the avalanche community is that the high consequence of an avalanche involving students in an instructional setting merits a preventive approach whereby we place guidelines and limitations on instructors in order to ensure a safe environment. So that leads us to the situation of priorities and vulnerabilities for avalanche instruction at the P2 level and considerations of the working group. So when talking about the instructional activities that could be undertaken by P2 instructors, the working group considered that the increased latitude of the P2 workplace aligned with instructional practice that was transitioning from rules-based instruction to knowledge-based instruction. In other words, there are situations where the terrain travel will be influenced by the learning objective in ways that depend on the knowledge of the instructor, and that these situations are difficult to script. So blanket terrain restrictions no longer work in this context. Point number 3 deserves to be highlighted because the working group was clear that it is at this threshold, the P2 level, where there's the most concern about inappropriate practice. For instance, instructors taking on work that looked more like guiding than avalanche instruction. During the working group discussion, there was an agreement that the risks to students and instructors are greatly minimized if instructors are operating in familiar terrain. For instance, ski area avalanche workers are likely to have local knowledge about their near backcountry that would allow them to run safe avalanche courses there. Likewise, highway technicians operating in their home territory. Familiar with the terrain also allows instructors to target good sites to accomplish learning objectives to the benefit of students. The next part of this presentation looks at how familiarity with terrain could be used in guidelines for instructor practice at the P2 level. So to start our look at how terrain familiarity helps instructors practice, first we'll look at the objectives that take instructors into terrain and the matching ideal terrain environment. Then we'll look at some of the threats that pose barriers to good practice, before finally considering the effect that familiarity can have on encouraging good practice. Much of this is review of our earlier working group discussions. So at the P2 level, the objectives of instructors in terrain are simply to travel to and from study and exercise sites with groups under a variety of weather and avalanche conditions, the appropriate handling of injured and uninjured students in the event of an emergency, that is, the ability to get students on and off the terrain, and separately the ability to summon help in the event of an emergency, because this might be quite unrelated to getting students in and out. And finally, and very importantly, terrain assists the purposes of instruction. And of course, this is a major point. The whole reason for going into terrain is to assist the purposes of instruction. So the first three of these points are related to the safety of students and the instructor. And the last of the points is how instruction brings benefits to the students. So good terrain can greatly facilitate avalanche instruction. Ideally, instructors will make choices of terrain that aligns with the following goals. Moving efficiently with a group in terrain maximizes learning benefits and minimizes exposure to threats. Exposure to incremental amounts of risk, in other words, just enough risk to achieve the learning objective, is a feature of avalanche instruction identified by the working group. Options to manage the group in terrain include managing students under emergency conditions. And terrain with appropriate routes and sites also means terrain that allows instructors to model real conditions that are characteristic of what the students may be expected to encounter in their own experience. Terrain with several options for routes, sites, and emergency response is better than terrain with few options. We have already discussed the basic nature of threats to instructors and students posed by avalanche terrain, but it's worthwhile to recap them here. The students' and instructors' activities could lead to physical harm. The students' experiences in avalanche terrain could have a negative effect on the students' confidence and progress towards autonomy. And providing guidelines could affect the delivery of courses. So the meta effect of the regulation that we're doing could impact the net benefit of avalanche education. So how does familiarity help? Well, familiarity does reduce uncertainty because the instructor is knowledgeable about where the group is going. Familiarity can frame what can and can't be done on a given piece of terrain because the instructor will know the features, the study sites, and the routes available. And familiarity can increase the alignment of the outings and the safety plan because the safety plan can be written with specific pieces of terrain in mind. Familiarity doesn't necessarily guarantee that the terrain is appropriate for instructing. An instructor can be familiar with the extremely aggressive terrain, for instance. Nor does it provide a path to unrestricted practice because ultimately we will say that the highest level of practice in avalanche instruction is an instructor that can go into unfamiliar terrain and provide a valuable learning experience. And as we've discussed at the working group, this is something that does happen from time to time, even in professional level courses. So familiarity, interestingly, by definition of risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So if you are familiar and you reduce uncertainty, then you definitely do have a beneficial effect on risk. So there is something about familiarity that is definitely related to less risk in instructional environments. So I think this is a very important point. But on the other hand, it's not quite enough. So in addition, when we're building our layers of protection, in addition to familiarity, there needs to be something about thoughtful selection of terrain, and there needs to be something that throws ahead to the next discussion about higher levels of practice, that instructors have to have ways to develop beyond familiarity, and I think we'll discuss all of these points later on. So the layers of protection that we discussed before there's three of them. There's established protocols, there's an avalanche program, and there's consultation and supervision. Now, Better Solutions provide both protection and opportunities for instructors to work. And as we've talked before, the combinations are literally infinite. So at the P2 level, under the first layer of protection, which are established protocols, we find that from our discussion that there's a requirement for 4 elements. The avalanche safety plan is expanded to consider some specific points. And these are group management in avalanche terrain, terrain use in a variety of weather and avalanche conditions, emergency response optimization for injured and uninjured students. The second point, avalanche safety plan describes commonly used terrain in terms of suitability for instructional objectives and safety. So this is moving towards a terrain atlas approach for the P2 instructor. Third, clear communication of risks to students. So students understand how the instructor will manage physical risks. And secondly, students understand how the instructor will propel them towards autonomy. The first point is usually handled by a risk waiver and assumption of liability. The second one is kind of a new element, but it sort of falls logically from our discussion on what are the risks that students entail. And so I thought it was interesting to put it in here, at least for discussion. And lastly, and what this presentation has been mostly about, is that a requirement that instructors at the P2 level operate in familiar terrain, and that instructors can demonstrate their familiarity with their terrain. And this is a point that we haven't quite covered yet, but we will in a couple of slides. The second layer of protection is at the avalanche program. And here the proposal is that P2 level instructors follow an established curriculum provider, but at this level they may adjust delivery according to the instructional needs. So they have an established curriculum, but maybe they alter the order of the lessons, or they highlight certain lessons over others. These things are tailored according to the particular instructional environment that they have, and P2s are allowed this latitude. The third level of consultation and supervision, P2 level instructors have safety plans that are available to students and peer professionals. And so the idea is that the constraint on P2 level instructors is that their safety plans are public, and that the onus is then on peer professionals to signal to whatever complaint mechanism that is in place whether or not there's a problem with this particular kind of practice. The P2 levels instructors conduct safety check-ins after every field trip with someone capable of initiating rescue, and of course this was determined to be kind of a baseline requirement for any instructional outing, is that there should be some sort of way that instructors check in. And thirdly, for the same reasons, P2 levels instructors make a yearly review of their practice available to peer professionals, and so that could be in terms of a report, or perhaps it is in terms of a discussion with a circle of peers. But in any event, that they would somehow make and record this yearly review of their practice. So, how can you demonstrate familiarity? Well, we already did have a small discussion on this, and it seems that there are some reasonable ways that you can describe features of terrain, including describing the avalanche history, describing threatened and safe zones, describing routes that allow groups access and egress from the site. So there's a descriptive element. And secondly, there's a documentation element of familiarity where the use of terrain is by instructors is documented through logbooks and trip reports. And of course, this is something that's highlighted in the main competency profile as being an essential characteristic of avalanche work. And thirdly, familiarity can be demonstrated through evaluation on the knowledge of and performance in terrain. And there are several possible evaluation sources. These could be workplace performance appraisals. They could be through job descriptions. In other words, if you satisfy a job description, then that says that you must access and use certain terrain, then this would be some sort of evidence of demonstrable familiarity. There's also examination through, for instance, a guides exam, or there's also the possibility of a peer group situation where a peer group gets together and evaluates each other's knowledge and performance in their terrain. So finally, what happens beyond familiar terrain? Because there is a level of instructor that is capable of taking students into unfamiliar, uncontrolled terrain. And I think that there's a couple of things that we can discuss as openings to that discussion, that either the instructor acts under the supervision of another instructor, which is quite obvious, or some sort of combination of an explicit track record of handling students in these situations, experience, and so this is combined with the fact that the instructor has been evaluated on the ability to handle threats to students in unfamiliar terrain. And that concludes this presentation, but the final slide here presents the template for the layers of protection involved in guidelines for P2 avalanche instruction.